He was 3 minutes from missing the flight that would save his daughter's life, and the man in the $3,000 suit chose that exact moment to humiliate him in front of 200 strangers. If you have ever been judged before anyone bothered to know your story, stay with this video until the very end, and if it moves you even a little, hit like and subscribe right now, because what happens next will remind you why kindness always outlasts arrogance. The gate area at the airport buzzed with the low hum of rolling suitcases and boarding announcements. David stood near the counter with his 7-year-old daughter Lily gripping his hand, her small backpack shaped like a bumblebee bouncing against her back. He wore a faded grey hoodie, the sleeves frayed at the cuffs, and jeans that had been mended more than once. In his other hand, he held 2 boarding passes printed on cheap paper from a self-service kiosk, along with a folded voucher he had saved for months to afford this trip. David had once been an aircraft maintenance technician in the Air Force, the kind of man who could tell a healthy engine from a dying one just by the sound it made. But 3 years ago, after his wife passed away suddenly, his life had folded in on itself. Bills piled up. The technician's salary could not stretch to cover a mortgage, childcare, and grief all at once. He took a job as a delivery driver instead, one with flexible hours so he could be there when Lily got home from school. It paid less, but it let him tuck her into bed every night. That was worth more to him than any title. Today they were flying to see Lily's grandmother, who had been battling an illness and wanted, more than anything, to see her granddaughter one more time before her treatment began. David had scraped together enough for 2 economy tickets by working double shifts for 6 straight weeks. He hadn't slept properly in days. But none of that mattered when Lily looked up at him with her gap-toothed smile and asked if Grandma would be waiting at the airport when they landed. David thought back, briefly, to the years before all of this, to the concrete floor of a maintenance hangar where he had spent countless nights beneath the belly of aircraft twice his size, headlamp strapped to his forehead, hands blackened with grease, listening for the smallest deviation in an engine's rhythm. His instructors used to say that a good technician doesn't just fix planes, he learns to hear them the way a mother learns to hear her child's cry among 100 others. David had been one of the best in his unit. He had a gift for it, an instinct that could not be taught, only sharpened. When he left the service to be closer to his young family, he told himself the skill would always be there if he ever needed it again. He never imagined how soon, or how urgently, that would prove true. As they approached the boarding line, a man in a crisp charcoal suit sauntered past them, phone pressed to his ear, voice loud enough for the entire gate to hear. His name, though nobody around him needed to be told, was Marcus Vance, CEO of one of the city's largest logistics firms. He wore the kind of watch that cost more than David made in a year, and he carried himself like the airport existed solely to accommodate his schedule. When the gate agent called for priority boarding, Marcus strode forward without waiting his turn, and in doing so, brushed roughly past David, knocking the folded voucher out of his hand. It fluttered to the floor. Lily bent down instinctively to pick it up, but Marcus's polished shoe landed on the corner of the paper before she could reach it. "Watch where you're standing," Marcus snapped, not even glancing down at the little girl. When he finally looked at David, his eyes swept over the frayed hoodie, the mended jeans, the cheap paper boarding passes, and something like disdain crossed his face. "Let me guess. Coach seats, paid for with a coupon? People like you shouldn't be holding up the line for people who actually have somewhere important to be." A ripple of uncomfortable silence spread through the nearby travelers. Someone gasped. A woman nearby lowered her magazine, watching. David felt his face grow hot, not from anger but from the old familiar sting of being reduced to nothing in front of his daughter. He had survived worse than words. He had survived the silence of an empty house after his wife's funeral. He had survived nights when he counted coins for formula. But watching Lily's small hand tighten around his fingers, seeing her confused eyes dart between him and the stranger, that cut deeper than anything Marcus could have said about him directly. "I'm sorry," David said quietly, more for Lily's comfort than for Marcus's satisfaction, and stepped back to let the man pass. He picked up the voucher, smoothed its crumpled edge, and knelt beside his daughter. "It's okay, sweetheart. Some people just have bad days. Doesn't mean we do." Lily nodded, though her lower lip trembled slightly. David tucked a loose curl behind her ear and forced a reassuring smile. The kind fathers learn to manufacture even when their own chest feels tight with humiliation. Around them, boarding continued. Marcus disappeared down the jet bridge without a second glance. Already back on his phone. Already forgetting the small girl and her father he had just wounded. When their zone was finally called, David and Lily made their way down the same jet bridge, past the same rows of seats, until they reached their place near the back of the aircraft. Marcus, as it happened, was seated in first class, close enough to the cockpit that he could hear the low murmur of the crew preparing for departure. David buckled Lily's seatbelt, helped her arrange her stuffed rabbit on her lap, and settled into his own seat with the practiced exhaustion of a man who rarely allowed himself to rest. But something in him, some old instinct sharpened by years of listening to engines, refused to settle. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its slow taxi toward the runway, David's ears caught something the untrained passenger would never notice: a subtle irregularity in the engine's pitch, a faint stutter beneath the steady drone, the kind of sound that lived in the space between normal and wrong. His pulse quickened. He had heard that exact irregularity once before, years ago, on a training aircraft that had suffered a compressor stall mid-flight. It was not loud, it was not obvious. But it was there, and once you had trained your ear to hear it, you could not unhear it. He glanced out the window toward the wing, and in the fading afternoon light he saw something else. A thin, almost invisible trail of vapor near the engine housing that should not have been there under normal conditions. His hands went cold. He thought of Lily beside him, of her grandmother waiting at the other end of this flight, of every family on this plane trusting the machine beneath them to carry them safely home. David unbuckled his seatbelt, despite the illuminated sign above his head, and stood, his heart hammering as he made his way up the aisle. A flight attendant moved to intercept him, her expression polite but firm, explaining that passengers needed to remain seated during taxi. David lowered his voice, but there was an unmistakable urgency in it now. The same steady, controlled urgency he had once used in an aircraft hangar reporting a fault to a wing commander. "Ma'am, I need you to notify the captain immediately. I'm a former Air Force aircraft maintenance technician. I heard an irregular compressor sound in engine 2, and there's visible vapor near the housing that shouldn't be there. This needs to be checked before takeoff." The flight attendant hesitated, torn between protocol and the evident seriousness in his voice. Passengers nearby began to notice, murmurs rising, phones lifting to record. Marcus, seated only a few rows ahead in first class, turned in his seat, recognizing the man he had dismissed hours earlier, now standing in the aisle insisting something was dangerously wrong with the aircraft he was sitting in. The flight attendant radioed the cockpit. There was a pause, the kind of pause that stretches unbearably in moments of uncertainty, and then the captain's voice came over the intercom. Calm, but changed in tone, requesting that the aircraft hold its position on the taxiway while ground engineers conducted an immediate inspection. Minutes passed like hours. David returned to his seat, Lily's small hand slipping into his, her eyes wide with a child's instinctive understanding that something important, something serious, was happening around her. He held her hand and whispered that everything would be fine, that grown-ups were checking to make sure the airplane was healthy, the way a doctor checks a patient before surgery. She nodded slowly, trusting him completely, the way only a child can trust a parent who has never once let her down. Outside, ground crew in reflective vests hurried toward engine 2 with diagnostic equipment. Passengers pressed their faces to the windows, watching the inspection unfold beneath the wing. The tension inside the cabin was almost unbearable. 200 strangers united suddenly by uncertainty, by the fragile awareness of how much trust we place in machines and the people who understand them. Then the intercom crackled again. The captain's voice returned, steadier now, informing passengers that a mechanical anomaly had indeed been detected in engine 2, consistent with an early-stage compressor fault that, left unaddressed, could have caused significant engine failure during ascent. The aircraft would be returning to the gate for repairs, and a replacement engine inspection would be completed before any further departure. The captain thanked the passenger who had raised the alert, calling his intervention, in his own words, the reason every person on this aircraft would be going home safely tonight. A wave of applause broke out across the cabin, spontaneous and overwhelming, passengers turning to look at David with expressions of gratitude and awe. Lily beamed up at her father, suddenly understanding that the man beside her, the man who had been humiliated just hours earlier for his worn hoodie and coupon tickets, was the very reason everyone around her was safe. Marcus sat frozen in his first-class seat, his earlier words echoing uncomfortably in his own mind. He watched the man he had dismissed as beneath his notice being thanked, one, by strangers who understood instinctively that this quiet, humble father had just saved every life on board. Shame crept slowly across his face, the kind of shame that cannot be masked by an expensive suit or a confident posture. As passengers disembarked to await a replacement aircraft, Marcus approached David in the terminal, his earlier arrogance nowhere to be found. He stood awkwardly for a moment, searching for words that did not come easily to a man used to commanding rooms rather than apologizing in them. "I owe you an apology," Marcus finally said, his voice quieter than before. "I judged you the moment I saw you, and I was wrong, completely wrong. You just saved my life, you saved everyone's life, and the first treated you like you didn't matter." David studied him for a long moment, then offered a small, tired smile, the kind that carries no bitterness, only quiet dignity. "I used to fix airplanes for a living," he said. "Now I drive delivery trucks so I can be home for my daughter every night. Neither job makes me less of a man, neither one ever did." Marcus nodded slowly, something shifting visibly behind his eyes. The beginning of understanding that respect has nothing to do with the price of someone's clothing or the seat they can afford. He glanced down at Lily, who was watching him with the frank, unguarded curiosity only children possess, and for the first time that day, he crouched to meet her at eye level instead of looking past her. "Your dad is a hero," he told her softly. "I hope you know that." Lily nodded solemnly, as though she had known it all along, and reached out to shake his hand the way her father had taught her, small fingers disappearing inside his much larger palm. It was a strange, quiet moment between three strangers whose lives had collided over the space of a single afternoon, and none of them would forget it. The story did not end at the gate. In the weeks that followed, a young woman who had been seated 2 rows behind David posted a shaky video she had recorded during the emergency stop, capturing the trembling silence of the cabin and the captain's grateful announcement over the intercom. The clip spread quickly, shared by strangers who had never met David but felt somehow that his quiet composure represented something increasingly rare in the world: competence without arrogance, courage without applause. Reporters called. Neighbors he barely knew stopped him outside his apartment building to shake his hand. Through it all, David remained unmoved by the attention, more concerned with picking Lily up from school on time than with any interview request. He had learned long ago that recognition was fleeting, but the trust of a child was not, and he intended to protect that trust above everything else. In the days that followed, word of what happened spread through news outlets and social media, passengers sharing their accounts of the quiet single father who had saved an entire flight through knowledge nobody bothered to ask him about. Marcus, moved by more than public pressure, reached out privately, offering David a position at his company's aviation safety division, a role that would use his years of hard-earned expertise and finally pay him what his skill had always been worth. David accepted, not out of vengeance or vindication, but because it meant more time with Lily, more stability, more nights without counting coins. He never forgot the sting of that moment at the gate, but he chose, deliberately, not to let it define him. Instead, he let it remind him of something he already knew deep down, that true worth is never measured by what a person wears or how much they can afford, but by what they carry inside them. Quietly, faithfully, ready to rise the moment it is needed most. Months later, David stood in a new uniform, still simple, still humble, but this time stitched with the insignia of the very airline whose flight he had once saved. Lily sat in the front row of a small ceremony held in his honor, clapping with the same gap-toothed smile she had worn the day her father knelt beside her at a crowded gate and told her that some people simply have bad days. She understood now, more fully than any child her age should have to, that her father was not defined by strangers' judgments, but by the quiet courage he carried inside him every single day. And somewhere in that airport terminal, long after the cameras had left and the applause had faded, a simple truth remained, etched into the memory of everyone who had been on that flight. Kindness costs nothing, but judgment can cost everything. The man in the frayed hoodie, the one who had been humiliated for the shoes he wore and the coupon he carried, was the very same man whose steady hands and trained ears had kept 200 strangers safe in the sky. Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones holding everything together, and sometimes all it takes is one moment of courage to remind the world exactly who deserves to be seen.